Hey friends, welcome back to the NeuroSpicy Mom Pod, the cozy, sensory-safe internet nook where we talk about healing, parenting, neurodivergence, and all of the ways we can rebuild our lives from a place of truth instead of shame. I'm your host, Austin Marie, and today's episode is one that I wanted to record for a while because I keep seeing neurodivergent parents, people like us, being shamed for parenting in ways that actually work for their child's nervous system. And the part that keeps sitting heavy on my heart is that this shame doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a society that still believes good parenting is synonymous with control, obedience, and pushing a child beyond their emotional limits for the sake of adult comfort. I watched an online discussion the other day that genuinely made me stop in my tracks. People, adults, were arguing that children must be traumatized to learn those exact words, as if fear builds character, as if emotional pain somehow magically translates into maturity. And what scared me was not just the statement, but how many people liked it, agreed with it, defended it. And I kept thinking, we truly do not understand how children's brains work. We do not understand trauma, and we absolutely do not understand neurodivergence. So today, I want to zoom out and zoom in. I want to look at this from the big picture first, the psychological perspective, the developmental science, the ways that humans actually learn. And then I want to take us all the way down into the micro level, into the brain itself, and talk about what's happening neurologically when a child is dysregulated, when they're scared, when they're overwhelmed, and when they're supported, and what that looks like. My goal is to make this information accessible. So let's get into why normal parenting tips do not work for neurodivergent kids, and why the individualized, compassionate approach you're using is backed by decades of research, even if society hasn't caught up. The problem with normal parenting tips is that they are usually given without any understanding of what children actually need developmentally. We tell parents what to do, but we never teach them why certain behaviors happen in the first place. Parents are expected to shape their kids' emotions and behaviors without ever being given the scientific facts about how humans develop during infancy, toddlerhood, and the school-age years. And because this information is never taught, not in schools, not in most pediatrician visits, not in parenting classes, parents end up trying to manage their child's behavior through guesswork and cultural scripts rather than an understanding of the nervous system. For example, one of the most common pieces of advice given to new parents is to let the baby cry it out. Parents hear this everywhere, from relatives, from older generations, even from some outdated sleep training programs. But what they are not told is that what actually happens neurologically when an infant is left to cry without comfort. Babies don't have the brain structures to self-soothe. They don't produce the regulatory chemicals needed to bring themselves back into safety. Their only coping tool is connection. When we leave a baby to cry without responding, we are not teaching independence. We are teaching the infant's nervous system that their needs might not be met. The baby eventually stops crying, not because they've learned to calm down, but because their body shuts down in resignation. That is not self-soothing. That is survival mode. Then we move into toddlerhood, which society deems the terrible twos, as if it's a personality flaw rather than a neurological milestone. Toddlers have rapidly developing brains with almost no impulse control, very limited language for expressing their big feelings, and a nervous system that swings from joy to terror in seconds. Meltdowns at this age are not misbehavior. They are a biological necessity. They are how the nervous system learns to discharge overwhelming stress and then return to regulation. Every meltdown a toddler has is a practice round for emotional recovery. But instead of respecting this, society teaches parents to punish toddlers for melting down. We strip them away from the very developmental process that teaches the brain how to calm down. We punish children for doing exactly what they biologically need to do. And by the time kids reach school age, the expectations shift again. Instead of focusing on autonomy, problem solving, and emotional literacy, our culture becomes obsessed with obedience. Kids are expected to ask permission for every movement, every bathroom break, every basic need. They are taught that adults are the authority and the child's internal cues cannot be trusted. We don't model mutual respect to children. We demand they give us respect while withholding it from them. This instills compliance, not independence. It teaches kids to shrink themselves, to disconnect from their bodies, and to defer to authority even when something feels wrong, which is especially dangerous to neurodivergent kids who already struggle with introception and self-advocacy. All of this happens because society has decided that understanding the nervous system, our own biology, is optional, that it's a soft science, that parents don't need to know the most basic facts about child development or brain function. We treat emotional development as if it's some kind of personality preference instead of a biological process. But the nervous system controls everything, every emotion, every behavior, every moment of regulation or dysregulation. It is the foundation of human functioning. Yet, for some reason, instead of teaching parents how humans actually work, we hand them a set of rules and expectations based on outdated beliefs about obedience. So when neurodivergent kids struggle under this system, people blame the parents, not the missing science. They say, just be stricter, just be more consistent, just give consequences. They need to be punished. But none of that addresses the neurological truth of what's happening. Traditional parenting advice assumes a child who is already calm, already regulated, already connected, and already developmentally equipped to understand cause and effect. And neurodivergent kids often aren't starting there. They're not ignoring adults to be defiant. They're overwhelmed. They're not testing boundaries. They're trying to navigate a sensory world that feels too loud, too fast, too unpredictable. What looks like refusal is often just survival. This is why traditional strategies don't work. Not because parents are doing anything wrong, but because the advice was never based on developmental science to begin with. One of the biggest misunderstandings in parenting, and honestly in society as a whole, is the idea that children are intentionally manipulative. I hear people say things like, they're doing that to get attention, or they're just trying to get a reaction out of you, or they're pushing your buttons on purpose. And what blows my mind is how confidently adults say those sentences as if toddlers have the executive functioning of a 50-year-old politician, as if children are sitting there in their bedrooms like, if I scream at exactly 6:02 p.m., I can destabilize my mother, weaken her defenses, and secure my long-term goals. No child is doing this. What psychologists understand and what somehow never made its way into mainstream parenting advice is that children don't communicate through language the way that adults do. They communicate through behavior. A meltdown isn't manipulation, it's distress. Refusal isn't rebellion, it's overwhelm. Avoidance is not disrespect, it's dysregulation. All behavior is communication. A child cannot articulate, my sensory load is maxed out and I'm entering a defensive state. So they show you through their body. They might freeze, lash out, shut down, scream, run, refuse, or collapse. These behaviors aren't strategic, they're biological. But because parents are not taught this, because no one teaches nervous system responses or emotional development or interoception, parents interpret these behaviors through a moral lens instead of a neurological one. And here's where the isolation comes in. Neurodivergent parents often instinctively understand what their child is going through because they've lived those shutdowns and overwhelm states themselves. They see their kids become dysregulated and think, yeah, I know exactly what that feels like. But instead of receiving validation for that emotional attunement, they're often dismissed or criticized. Neurodivergent parents are told they're being too permissive, too sensitive, or too in their heads. They are told to ignore their intuition, an intuition rooted in lived experience and often in their own neurodivergence. And because the broader culture misunderstands the biology behind behavior, neurodivergent parents end up parenting in a completely different paradigm than everyone around them. And they often do it alone. This leaves so many neurodivergent parents feeling isolated, unsupported, and misunderstood. The loneliness isn't happening because ND parents are doing something wrong. It's happening because society refuses to acknowledge the science. If everyone understood the basics of child's development and nervous system function, ND parents wouldn't feel like outsiders. They wouldn't feel judged for responding with compassion instead of punishment. They wouldn't have to fight so hard to justify practices that are biologically correct. Because the truth is, when a neurodivergent parent responds to dysregulation with softness, stillness, or accommodation, they're not giving in. They're interpreting behavior accurately. They're speaking the nervous system's language. They're doing the job society never prepared them for, and they're doing it without the support they deserve. When we talk about behavior, especially difficult behavior, most of society jumps straight into judgments about discipline, willpower, or attitude. But the truth is, behavior is biology. Everything a child does in moments of overwhelm starts in the nervous system long before it showed up in their body. And this is where most traditional parenting advice completely collapses because it assumes children can think their way out of big feelings. It assumes they can reason their way into compliance. It assumes their choices are conscious. But you cannot reason with a brain that is in survival mode. Here's what actually happens inside a neurodivergent child's brain when they become overwhelmed, overstimulated, confused, or dysregulated. The first thing that activates is called the amygdala, often called the brain's alarm system. Its job is to scan for danger, but danger to the amygdala is not just physical. It can be emotional danger too. Unpredictability, social pressure, confusing instructions, sensory overload, transitions, demands that feel too big, disappointment, embarrassment. Neurodivergent kids often have amygdalas that are more sensitive, more reactive, and more easily triggered. They're not being dramatic. Their threat detection system is simply tuned higher. Once the amygdala senses danger, which could be something as small as a change in routine or the classroom suddenly becoming loud, it sends a signal to the entire body, we are not safe. And this signal is not metaphorical. It is chemical, real, measurable biology. The moment that alarm goes off, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for thinking, reasoning, impulse control, listening, planning, problem solving, and emotional reflection, it begins to shut down. This is not a choice the child makes. The brain simply reallocates resources towards survival. From an evolutionary standpoint, when the brain perceives danger, it's not interested in learning or cooperating. Its only job is to protect the child. That is why a dysregulated child cannot just calm down, just listen, or just use their words. Those skills require a fully online prefrontal cortex, and during dysregulation, that part of the brain is essentially offline. Parents ask their child to access a part of the brain that, in that moment, is not available to them. Meanwhile, the nervous system floods with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rates go up, muscles tighten, sensory input becomes louder, brighter, sharper. Vision narrows, hearing distorts, the body prepares for fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. This is why some kids lash out, some run away, some melt down, some go silent, and some become limp and disconnected. These are not choices. These are survival states. Now, here's where things get even more misunderstood. For neurodivergent kids, the return to baseline takes longer. Their bodies don't discharge stress at the same rate as neurotypical kids. They may stay overwhelmed longer, or they might crash into shutdown, or they might carry the stress inside until they get home and feel safe enough to release it. And because parents aren't taught any of this, because the education system, medical system, and culture at large do not explain how a child's brain actually functions, adults misinterpret these neurological states as behavior problems. They assume the child is misbehaving, manipulating, pushing limits, or being disrespectful, when in reality, the child is experiencing a full body stress response that they cannot escape. For neurodivergent parents, this knowledge often comes from personal experience rather than education. ND parents recognize these signs in their kids because they've lived them in their own bodies. They know what it feels like when the world becomes too loud or too fast or just too overwhelming. They know what it feels like to be misunderstood or to be punished for something they couldn't control. They know the shame of being told to calm down when their brain was screaming for safety. But when ND parents try to explain this, when they try to offer context or advocate for their child's neurological experience, we are often dismissed as being dramatic or overprotective. We are told all kids get overwhelmed, or you're making excuses, you're coddling them, or what my son's last preschool teacher said, you're using his autism as a crutch. Meanwhile, these parents are the only ones actually understanding what is happening biologically. This is another layer of that isolation. ND parents aren't just parenting differently. They're parenting with an awareness that society refuses to acknowledge. They're translating their child's nervous system while everyone around them misinterprets it. They're co-regulating while being criticized for not punishing. They're reading signals that others don't see, and they're doing it without the social support that should exist for every parent, especially those raising neurodivergent children. When we zoom into the brain, everything about ND parenting becomes clear. The behavior isn't the problem, the misunderstanding is. And ND parents are not failing. They are the ones actually grounded in science. There is this persistent belief, one that shows up in parenting, in schools, in online comment sections, and honestly, just the broader culture air that we all breathe, that trauma builds character, that hardship makes children strong, that harshness creates resilience. You hear people say things like, kids these days are too soft, or I got spanked and I turned out just fine, or if you don't toughen them up now, the world will do it later. And the part that hurts the most is that these beliefs don't just float around in theory, they shape how real children are treated every single day. But here's what developmental psychology and neuroscience have proven again and again. Trauma does not teach. Trauma shuts the brain down. Trauma does not strengthen children, it fragments them. The idea that kids need trauma to learn is not only outdated, it is scientifically impossible. So let's talk about why. When a child is afraid, truly afraid, the brain shifts into that survival mode. We know that the amygdala takes over and the prefrontal cortex goes offline. And then the nervous system prepares to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. It doesn't matter whether the fear is caused by a screaming adult or a humiliating punishment or a high-stakes threat of losing love or safety. The brain doesn't distinguish between those. To the child, it's danger. And a brain in danger cannot learn. It cannot reason. It cannot reflect. It cannot grow. Learning requires access to that prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for insight and regulation, memory, empathy, problem solving, and understanding consequences. Trauma blocks that access. So when adults use fear as a teaching tool, what they're actually doing is making the brain less able to absorb the lesson they think they're teaching. What trauma does teach is very different. Trauma teaches children that the world isn't safe. Trauma teaches children that mistakes are dangerous. Trauma teaches children to silence their needs. Trauma teaches children to mask. Trauma teaches children to disconnect from their emotional experience to survive the moment. And that last one, The masking is especially devastating for neurodivergent kids. ND children already lean heavily on masking as a survival tool because so much of the world is built for neurotypical brains. So when adults use fear or shame in moments of overwhelm, ND kids quickly learn that their authentic self is the thing causing the problem. They learn to suppress, hide, or disconnect from the very parts of their brain and body that need the most support. This is why so many ND adults today carry layers of internalized shame, self-doubt, people-pleasing tendencies, RSD, sensory avoidance, and a deep fear of disappointing others. These aren't personality traits. They are the long-term neurological footprints of having been treated harshly in childhood while being neurodivergent in a world that didn't know or care what that meant. And when adults say things like, well, I turned out fine, what they often mean is, I survived. But surviving is not the same thing as thriving. Surviving doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Surviving doesn't mean it didn't shape your entire nervous system. Surviving doesn't mean it didn't leave scars. And one of the saddest parts is that many adults don't even realize how much they still carry from their own childhood because they were never taught to look at their own responses through a neurological lens. They see anxiety and call it overthinking. They see hypervigilance and call it responsibility. They see emotional numbness and call it maturity. They see people-pleasing and call it easygoing. They don't recognize trauma because trauma became their normal. And so when people argue that trauma is necessary, what they are actually saying is, I was hurt and I need to believe it made me stronger. But trauma doesn't create strength. Safe connection does. Trauma doesn't build resilience. Co-regulation does. Trauma does not produce emotional maturity. Modeling and support do. The research consistently shows that children become resilient, not by being hardened, but by being held. They don't learn emotional intelligence by being shamed, but by being taught. They do not grow stronger because they suffered, but because someone helped them navigate suffering with compassion. Real resilience comes from knowing you can return to safety. Real resilience comes from knowing someone will help you carry hard things. Real resilience comes from having your nervous system supported, not suppressed. And for neurodivergent kids whose nervous systems experience the world more intensely, more unpredictably, and often more painfully, this becomes even more important. Trauma does not just create emotional wounds for ND children, it creates long-term patterns of self-abandonment. It teaches them to distrust their own internal cues. It disconnects them from their own sensory experiences, and it wires their brain towards survival instead of curiosity. This is why ND kids raised with respect, safety, co-regulation, and individualized parenting grow into ND adults who actually understand themselves. They don't have to unlearn shame to find identity. They don't have to reparent themselves from scratch. They don't have to spend years wondering why they can't function the way everyone else seems to. They already know their nervous system because someone taught them how it works instead of punishing them for how it works. In a culture that still praises toughness and calls empathy soft, choosing to understand a child's nervous system isn't permissive. It's revolutionary. You are breaking the cycle. You're choosing science over shame, and you're giving your child the resilience that trauma never could. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I know this conversation was big and tender and validating in all the right ways. And I hope you walk away from this episode feeling seen in the way you parent and grounded in the truth that your child's nervous system deserves understanding, not judgment. You are doing such deep, intentional work, and I'm grateful to walk alongside you in it. Okay, friends, before we go, we're moving into my absolute favorite part of every episode, and I want to give you a little heads up about what's happening next so you can choose your own adventure. We are going to move into our weekly journaling prompt for anyone who likes to end the episode with a little reflection. If you want to stay, I love that. If you're done for today, no worries at all. I love you. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week. For everyone staying with me, let's get into it. If you're here for the reflective side of things, hi, my loves, this part is for you. And as always, if you want access to our full library of journal prompts, the video versions of each episode, and our cozy little indie community where you never have to mask, you can join our NeuroSpicy squad on Patreon. A quick reminder, signing up on the desktop avoids the extra mobile fees on the Apple ads, so don't do that. Before we get into the prompt, let's take one grounding breath together. Inhale and exhale. Release your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and feel your body settle. Here's the journal prompt. What is one moment when you saw your own dysregulation reflected in your child and realized that co-regulation was what both of you needed? I'll read that one more time. What is one moment when you saw your own dysregulation reflected in your child and realized that co-regulation was what both of you needed? I love you. Thank you for being here. And of course, we'll see you next week. Ta-ta.